video, we will be enjoying a war horror film, entitled Our Point. There will be spoilers ahead, chill out and enjoy. The movie begins in the year 1972. South Korean soldiers from Battalion 53 disappeared during the Vietnam War after venturing to Our Point, a strategically significant island located about 150 kilometers south of Saigon. After 6 months of not being seen or heard from, the soldiers are all but written off as dead when a shortwave radio signal is received from Our Point. Over the next 3 months, the communication continues irregularly, always with the same message. In response, headquarters sends out a rescue team to look for the men, despite the fact that the lone survivor claims he saw them all killed and that he himself took their dog tags. On the other hand, Lieutenant Choi Tae-in, a renowned combat veteran, has been assigned by headquarters to lead the expedition as punishment for his transgression. He has been entrusted with 9 other soldiers and given 7 days to find the missing soldiers. Headquarters then recruits personnel for the mission by promising an early discharge from the army and a flight home on a commercial airline if the mission is successful. After taking 2 pictures of the expedition crew, the men sailed to the island known as Our Point. However, they encounter a Viet Cong ambush not long after entering the jungle. They duck behind cover and fire in the dark until Lieutenant Choi sneaks up on the pillbox's flank and disables it with a rocket launcher. They discover a female gorilla close to the decaying body of a Viet Cong soldier when they search the pillbox. While searching her for intel, one of the soldiers notices the cat bell bracelet she is wearing and considers stealing it. He swiftly gives up the plan after being warned that he will lose all feeling in his fingers if he takes it from a corpse. Lieutenant Choi abandons the girl after the group debates about who should kill her. A short while later, they reach a grassy field designated by 2 big stones with carvings depicting the history of Chinese and Vietnamese during the past war. They dismiss it as a hoax and decide not to give it any further thought because they are soldiers. In the evening, after the soldiers have set up camp, Corporal Jo Byung-hoon confesses that he is the son of a mortician and that the spot where the bodies are buried is not a good place for anyone, living or dead. The next morning, they wake up to find that they had been sleeping directly in front of a deserted French plantation. After clearing every room in the house, they start searching the premises. Sergeants Jang and Oh discover a small footlocker containing maps from the last French garrison and a malfunctioning tape player. After hearing the mission briefing, Sergeant Oh recalls that Sergeant Oh served in Battalion 53 and would be familiar with their appearance. Sergeant Oh disputed this, so Lieutenant Choi ordered to send out 2 teams to look for them. Corporal Jo gets separated from the rest of the search team because he needs to use the restroom. He gives a hopeless glance around and yells for help, but no one responds. Ultimately, he located the squad of soldiers in a nearby field. Indignant that the men are ignoring his calls, he speaks to them in a weak tone. Corporal Jo sees the last man named Jang Suk, written on his helmet, but the man exhibits no emotion and does not react. Upon turning around, he sees the soldiers lying flat in the tall grass, facing the forest from behind. As a response, he catches up, but he doesn't understand why no one else is standing up in response to the apparent absence of hostility. He looks around the grass but doesn't see anyone. When Corporal Jo goes missing, First Sergeant Jin informs Lieutenant Choi. They all follow him to the Chinese-built temple, where he meets up with Jin. They looked in every possible place before discovering Corporal Jo hiding in a hole. Later that day, back at the plantation, the other soldiers mock Corporal Jo for talking about seeing soldiers, specifically the one with the writings on his helmet. Corporal Jo's wild rantings upset Sergeant Oh, who finally orders him to stop when they hear a helicopter approaching. The men, astonished to see Americans so late at night, rush outside for a closer look. The U.S. troops, led by Sergeant First Class Beck, say they came to inspect the plantation's electrical batteries and warn that daytime visits are impossible due to the thick fog. When the Americans are done on the 2nd floor, Beck briefs Lieutenant Choi on the plantation's previous life as a French fort. He claims that the local French garrison was annihilated in a single raid by forces nobody had ever heard of before and that these forces were not the Viet Cong. Beck asserts further that there is 0 chance of survival at Our Point. He is delighted by Lieutenant Choi's ignorance and not being aware of the stories surrounding Our Point before their assignment. He wagers Lieutenant Choi's troops won't make it to the next maintenance trip 4 days later and warns the lieutenant not to touch the Americans' possessions on the 2nd level before he leaves. To wish the Koreans well, though, the Americans leave a rack of beer behind as they slip out into the darkness. Meanwhile, outside the plantation in a secluded area, Sergeant Oh encounters Corporal Jo. He roughs up the corporal and demands to know how the latter learned about Jang Suk's helmet. Sergeant Oh does not believe Corporal Jo when he again says that he saw the man with the helmet. When Sergeant Oh tries to talk to Corporal Jo, the latter shoves him away and says he's had enough. After returning to the plantation, Sergeant O gives the tape player to Corporal Bune, who is in charge of the radio. Bune assures him that he can fix it when he asks whether he can. Corporal Bune reported that Lieutenant Choi had stopped by and that the radio was just picking up signals from within the area. He continues by saying that he talked to a French soldier whose name was Jacques via a transmission he got from a unit not far from the plantation. Jacques said his twin brother Paul served in the same unit as him and that they were expecting their unit to be visited by the Koreans shortly. Lieutenant Choi replies that Corporal Bune will not understand the ostensible Frenchman's words anyway because he doesn't know French. Then, it's written off as evidence of extreme exhaustion. When Corporal Bune returns with the fixed tape player, the men relax in their bunks. He puts on some The Ventures song, and the guys break out into dance. They party until the music is replaced by what appears to be the last moments of the missing soldiers. The player screams and gunfire ring across the room. After that, Lieutenant Choi grabbed the player and watched the tape continuously in his bunk. Private Chung is seen by Sergeants O and Jang, who are on night patrol, as he makes his way through the woods. On the same night that the cat bells start ringing, Lieutenant Choi spots the Viet Cong girl who ambushed them earlier. The girl has mysteriously changed into a white dress and is currently wandering the plantation. In the morning, Sergeant Park reported that Private Chung had gone missing. Sergeant Park takes a break on the steps while he and Corporal Joe search the area. In other words, he orders Corporal Joe to move forward without him. A drop of blood falls on vain Sergeant Park as he checks his reflection in the mirror. Park looks up in disgust as a bucket full of blood splashes on him, scaring the living daylights out of him. Lieutenant Choi investigates and finds the body of Private Chung, who had been found hanging from the plantation's roof. After hearing that the Viet Cong was responsible for Chung's death, Choi decides to investigate his immediate surroundings. Sergeant Jin visits the temple and discovers incense being burned at the altar. He concludes that the Viet Cong paid their respects at this grave. Therefore, he orders his men to plant booby traps around the temple, hoping to eliminate any Viet Cong who returns to the temple to relight the incense. Later that night, when he reported back to headquarters, Choi's superior mocked him for being delusional. Private Chung is said to be one of the missing men, and he was only supposed to have 9 men with him. The soldiers start to think back of Chung, and they recall that they only saw him during the landing, not at the docks. To back up their suspicions, they examine the photographs they took, and sure enough, there is Private Chung among them. They have a hunch about the supernatural, but they're not sure. Ultimately, only Lieutenant Choi knows the truth. Sergeant O remembers his squad comrade, the one who wore the Young Suk helmet, and reflects back on their time together. He recalls that his friend gave him a camera to give to Young Suk, but after hearing that his friend had vanished at our point, Sergeant O kept the camera for himself. Upon further inspection, Lieutenant Choi realizes that the same Viet Cong girl is spotted outside the plantation. This time, he accidentally finds himself in a cemetery containing the graves of French troops after following the girl. As he surveys the tombstones, he is taken aback by the one with the inscription Jacques et Paul. Recalling Corporal Bune's description of the transmission, he becomes persuaded that the entire our point base is haunted. His return to the base is met with the sound of a booby trap being triggered by the soldiers. In a pool of his own blood, they discover Sergeant O lying in the temple. It appears like O was caught in a trap. Eventually, he reaches out to Corporal Joe, begs forgiveness after becoming disillusioned, and repeats his apologies. After the incident, First Sergeant Jin informed Lieutenant Choi that he would be in charge of assembling a search team to look for the missing people. 2 groups of them left the following morning. Sergeant Jin sends his team on a hunt for the dog tags, and then, while they're looking, he pulls several out of his pocket and tosses them on the ground. Jin is shown in a flashback, receiving the dog tags and being tasked to perform the mission. Since First Sergeant Jin's team lost radio contact with Lieutenant Choi during the hunt, they hunkered down in a clearing to try to establish contact. He leaves his men to explore the woods on his own and eventually falls into a valley. Since Corporal Bune can't seem to track down First Sergeant Jin, he's taking charge of the squad and heading to meet up with Lieutenant Choi. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Choi showed up at the site of a downed UH-1 Huey helicopter. Sergeant First Class Beck's body is discovered, and he recognizes him immediately due to his peace necklace. Only Sergeants O and Jang were willing to accompany Lieutenant Choi, and they were terrified. Before continuing their investigations, they plan to get together with Corporal Bune. Since Jin finds himself in a valley, he soon discovers the caves that lie within. He overhears the initial transmission to headquarters and proceeds there to look into it. He approaches a hole in the cave's wall and sees a soldier standing there, his back to him, talking on a radio. As he turns the operator around, he reveals a dead body, yet the communication continues. Corporal Joe encounters a ghost while he meets up with Choi. He reports this to Corporal Lee, who orders him to fire at anything that moves. He believes he sees Sergeant O approaching from the distance and fires his M16. Choi is approaching from the direction he shot in. Sergeant O is fatally shot during the commotion. After arriving at the base, the men watch as Lieutenant Choi breaks into the chamber housing the American supplies. They look for batteries but only come upon rusted, non-working radios. Lieutenant Choi concluded that the Americans were likewise dead and ghosts because the chamber had been abandoned for a long time. The soldiers start to freak out as Corporal Lee points the machine gun at Choi. Choi tosses the weapon out of the way casually and smacks Lee to bring him to his senses while the guys bring the radio to the bunks for repair. As soon as Corporal Bune fixes the radio, he tries to make contact with the headquarters. The inadequacy of his actions raises the stakes. Then, all of a sudden, Lieutenant Choi calls for an immediate evacuation over the radio. The soldiers will be picked up by a chopper at 5:50 a.m., as confirmed by headquarters. As the transmission ends, sounds can be heard coming from beyond the plantation's borders. The troops adopt defensive positions, but First Sergeant Jin soon returns with the radio and the severed head of the operator. A distraught Sergeant Park desperately begs him to spare his life as he runs to him in a panic. After Jin asked if that was what Park wanted, he took him by the head and severed his head. Choi shoots him dead, knowing full well that the ghost is using the soldiers against each other. Corporal Bune eventually loses it, too, and uses a bomb to blind Sergeant Jang. Then Corporal Lee falls to the ground, asking why he must endure such pain, and Corporal Joe shoots him in the head. Choi treats Jang's wounds after shooting Joe. As he was bandaging Jang up, he noticed a photo in Jang's left breast pocket. He pulls out the photo, revealing the French garrison. He scans the crowd and spots a familiar face among the Frenchmen, the Viet Cong girl. Just then, he hears additional footsteps and turns around to see the Viet Cong female standing right in front of him. He tries to use his machete to attack the girl but fails. The Viet Cong girl bursts out into laughter, causing an eye injury. Choi tries to fight off the girl's possession, but she's too powerful. Fearing that he'll be overpowered and killed, he instructs Jang to point the gun at him and shoot. Choi was fatally wounded at the last second, prompting Jang's desperate pleas for help. Being blindfolded has protected Jang from the ghost's possession. He cannot see them and hence is secure from them. Jang, mentally unhinged, mutters incoherently until morning. He keeps naming names and claims that everyone is playing a prank on him. The rescue chopper contacts headquarters to report that they have located one survivor, Jang, with the corpses of the 8 other missing soldiers. The movie ends with the same grimy radio that started the scene, dripping with blood, but this time it reads Mole 3, Choi's Squad. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this and help the channel grow.